Hello. In our last couple of lectures, I am talking about the role of human resource function. The role of human resource function in contributing and meeting the organizational objectives as well as individual needs. In my last lecture, we also talked about the scope and details of manpower planning. Today, we will talk about the selection, recruitment related aspects. As you know, in the technology era, in the knowledge era, the selection is becoming more and more critical. Selection processes are seen and practiced with utmost care so that long-term health of the organization is maintained. And when we have to understand the details, we can cover many things, but in this lecture I intend to cover the following. You should be able to learn and understand the following: the selection process, concept and definition, the role of selection process, the selection process, its details, and probably we will also talk about the types of interviews and the how to conduct and how to select people in the organization. When we see selection and recruitment, recruitment is the process of, as I mentioned earlier, to get a qualified group of people to the organization. So, group of potential candidates to the organization is recruitment. If you get them, if you make them apply, if you are perceived as a most preferred employer, and all such things are part of the recruitment. But once you have the set of applications before you, set of applicants, set of candidates are there before you, then we start talking about the selection process. Selection process is one involves picking the right individuals out of the pool of job applicants and making sure their qualification, their competence match the job vacancies in the organization. So, we have the job analysis, then based on the job analysis we have the job description, based on the job description we have the job specification. The specification also gives the job requirements, the details of the person who can meet and perform all the jobs, and now we start seeing amongst the applicants who could meet these specifications and the requirements. Now, when we see this, we can always get into the nitty-gritties, but let us look at the formal definition of selection process. It is the process of differentiating between applicants in order to identify and then hire those with a greater likelihood of success in a job. So, that means we try and see what is that selection criteria should be. So, the selection criteria normally we would like to get the candidates who are able, that means ability to perform the given task. Then the second criteria is those of them are willing, who have the right aptitude to perform the job and also have that fire in the belly, that willingness to perform. And the third is that they will make an adjustment to the organizational culture and they become good co-workers, they become good team members and such expectations. And also the last one is they will stay for a reasonable period of time. So, the ability to perform, the willingness to exert and the capacity to adjust with others, as well as a mental mindset to stay for a reasonable period of time. I think these four things always we try and look at the time of selection of the candidate. So, that is where we are trying to differentiate between the applicants with respect to these four things. So, someone may be a very capable person, his ability is very high, but we may feel that he may not adjust with others, he may not be a good team player. Another situation we see is a great team player, but does not possess the required qualification. Or we may see great in terms of the qualification and ability, and also has the willingness to perform, and also a good team player, but we have reasons to suspect that he may not stay for a long time for what we are giving as like opportunities or growth paths or compensation, and then we may not hire that kind of a person. So this is where the selection process becomes one of differentiating between applicants and then try and match with respect to what the organization can offer. So it is in that sense, selection definitely is the process of making a hire or no hire. Either the candidate would be in or not. So the decision regarding each applicant for a job. So the process typically involves determining the characteristics required for effective job performance on the one side, and on the other the measuring the applicants on those characteristics. So the characteristics required for effective job performance are really we will obtain through this job analysis. So as we put it, the selection becomes the process of making of hire and no hire decision, and then so we need to see how we are going to analyze, how we are going to compare, shall we adopt one method or multiple methods. Those are the matter of details. So finding the best becomes one of the complex exercises in any organization, and involves several steps, and sometimes it is sequential, sometimes it is to be done parallelly. As we are seeing is that we have the recruitment plan, there is an assessment of the need, then we also have the kind of the job vacancies. So the job vacancies gets in terms of definition of the job, then we get the kind of pool with which we can meet the requirements. So the recruitment plan throws those items. So that means we will see whether we can get it from through a set of web applications, or through going through a consultant, or through anyone else. So the identifying the labor pool and also the sources of the applicants becomes one of the critical exercises. And then we get the application either through the prescribed format, or through voluntary applications, or through the kind of a web related things. So once we have this series of applications, which we can also see can get through the kind of a process of advertisement. It could be when you put this advertisement, it could be on a website, it could be through radio or the employee referrals, then it could be some school TV channels, then some flyers, then newspaper, or kind of a newsletter of the professional organizations, or sharing informally through grapevine, or these college, campus, school bulletin boards. So many of these things when you do, then we do get into the set of the applications. And the other side, you also one can do is that people do call over phone, or it could be walk-ins. So there are applications over telephone, or applications coming directly to the organization, again which you can screen and file. So all this would indicate that recruitment is based on the kind of plans, and also based on several activities what one can do depending on the kind of attraction it has in the labor market situation. So once we have a pool of applicants for a given job vacancy, then we move on to the next step of various selection process. It could be the interview, or it could be anything else. So the selection test and the interview defines the next process. The idea is only to finding the best under the circumstances. So as we see that not only we try and select, but also we talk about the how we can develop a systematic selection program. In development of a selection program, as I mentioned earlier, starts with the job analysis. The job analysis can be done through systematically documenting all the activities what one would perform. Then identification of relevant job performance dimensions in terms of the quantity, in terms of the quality, in terms of the deliverables, in terms of the complexity, in terms of the working conditions, in terms of the enabling support, what one would have on the job, the group work or it is individual work, or the work which demands a close supervision or broad guidance or guidelines. And then we also start seeing the identification of knowledge, skills and the abilities, what normally called as KSAs, to perform that kind of a job. So after this third step, then we start seeing what are the development of the assessment devices to measure KSAs. That means how do we make sure that the person has the required knowledge? How do we measure these skills? How can we measure these abilities? So that means we can think of one, two or several methods of measuring these knowledge, skills and abilities, which are necessary to perform the job. Then we want to make sure the validation of the assessment device. Assessment devices, to be seen in terms of its content, whether it contains all the required dimensions, parameters, and similarly what is the construct and what is the criterion. So let us say that we are talking about personality. So that means we have to see what is the personality assessment going to be. So then we may choose that a trait based kind of an instrument, and then you will see how is this construct of this personality, and then also we would see what is the kind of a criterion around which we will accept the candidate or we would reject the candidate. So then use of this assessment devices, well then we will put it into the processing of applications. So unless some of these things are done a priori, the selection becomes cumbersome and complex. But once the procedures are adopted and defined, it enables a good selection process. So one of the steps definitely one would like to make sure is that what are the key performance characteristics. Do they perform under complex circumstances? Do they do a cutting edge performance? Is it very innovative? So what are the key performance characteristics is one. Second is what is the applicant's ability versus motivation, and ability and motivation. Some are very able people, some are very willing people, but organization wants very clearly both able as well as willing people. And then one also need to see who will select these people. Is it going to be the HR activity? Is it going to be the HR as well as some line managers would get involved? Are there any specialists would get involved? The specialist from within the organization or specialist from the outside the organization, or in terms of the top management. But any selection process means it is time, it is effort, and so one need to see how to manage these effort as well as the time. And when we see the role of selection in influencing organizational effectiveness, I think one need not have to think there are several reasons, but it is crucial for at least two reasons. First, work performance depends on individuals. So unless there is a right man for the right job, unless the person with the right fire in the belly, what people talk about, with right passion and right initiatives, then there are problems. Similarly, the cost incurred in recruiting and hiring personnel speaks volumes for the role of selection. In other words, when you spend so much time, normally it is estimated it takes about these, if you look at the average salary, it is the 3-month salary is what is involved for per selection cost. So that means if you are selecting one individual in whatever the format you calculate, you will spend approximately about 3 months salary for as a kind of a hiring decision. So if someone comes and leaves, so that means virtually you are losing about 3 months salary. Some organizations also have estimated It is anywhere between 8 months salary to 12 months salary in a very complex selection process. So in other words, one should also see what is the kind of a cost implication. One should also further see what is the impact it has on the people who are already there in the organization. So if somebody leaves, it always creates extra work for the people, but also affects their morale in performing their task and contributing to the organization. So the best way to look at is to improve performance means it is to hire the right people who have the competence and also the willingness to work. So the exploring that the individuals have the required competence, exploring that they have the right aptitude, and then the right motivation to match the organizational conditions becomes extremely complex task. I think that's what we are trying to see, how is that we can make it happen. So it's a long process, commencing from very preliminary interview of applicant and ending with a kind of a contract of employment. So it starts with that kind of a job analysis and do all the back end work, and in the front end receiving the application and making sure that the candidate gives all the required information in a valid and an open fashion, and that can be processed up to the selection decision, and then making a contract and making sure that the selected person joins the organization. So it becomes it's a long process and a lengthy process. And you also see selection process differs among various organizations and also between jobs within the same organization. Sometimes the organization is in a hurry, and then they have to compromise on many of the standard procedures which they would like to follow. Sometimes the number of applications are too many, where one job, if you see there could be about 300 to 400 applicants. Now then you don't have time to get to the detailed application formats and screening and doing such things. Maybe you have to give some tests to eliminate a large pool of people, and so once you go through the elimination process, and then you start focusing on the selection process. So it depends on several of these conditions to see what could be the best selection process. And having attracted applicants for the job, it becomes the next stage is to select candidates who is most suitable for the job and the company. And we need to see the step by step the various selection methods, and then make sure that each of the selection methods we deploy are cost effective, and they have to provide a value addition to the whole selection process. So one can think of several of the things in some order. There is nothing like this should be or this shall be, but it is always good to start with preliminary interviews. A preliminary interviews is to spend a little time and have a quick dialogue with the candidates, but make sure that the individual is meeting all the basic minimum criteria. We also use the selection test. Selection test typically of psychological in nature. Some are psychomotor tests, some are aptitude tests, but we will see what are the details of the selection test. Then certainly we have the employment interview. In employment interview, it becomes a face-to-face dialogue between one and several members of the organization with the job applicants, and the dialogue, the discussion, the sharing of information, and understanding the behavior and aptitude of the person will make good selection process, and that is what is possible during the interview. And the other important thing is checking of the references and checking of the background of the candidate, and the background analysis and references and use of that to match what is expected by the organization. And finally, making into a selection decision. So one need to use some of the information in parallel or in sequential, or use all the things together at the end to make a decision to hire or not to hire. So when we see the selection process, apart from that you also have to get into the physical examination. so that he is physically fit and does not carry any previous known occupational diseases and hazards. And also the next step is to make a job offer, and depending on whether the candidate accepts the offer or not, and then you move to the next one is a kind of an employment contract. And where employment contract you specify all the terms and conditions of employment and the specific benefits, opportunities what you are going to provide for the potential applicant, or so the applicant who is going to join as a kind of a potential employee. So then the last step is evaluation, so that all the steps are performed in a systematic way, and each of the steps adopted provides a value in selecting right candidates for the right job. Then as we start seeing these steps, it should be done in relation to the other steps, and each of the steps need to contribute substantially to the understanding of the candidates, and also to help anyone in coming to the judgment of hire or no hire kind of a decision. So when we look at the preliminary interview, it is more or less the kind of same as the scrutiny of applications, but now you are meeting the candidate in a face-to-face manner. So any interview means it is the dialogue between one or several of the organizational members and the candidate. So in a preliminary interview, you make sure that by appearance, by acceptance, by whatever the basic details you have mentioned, you have thought of based on the job analysis to the job requirements, then you see whether the candidate is acceptable or unacceptable. So unless some basic expectations are met, the preliminary interview becomes a kind of an elimination process, elimination of all the unqualified applicants. So the scrutiny enables the HR specialist to eliminate not only the unqualified job seekers, but based on the then you also have to see how they have filled in the supplied application forms. So organizations would like to design their own applications so that in a standardized way you can compare their education, the experience, the family background, as well as the kind of contributions what they have made in the past jobs. So it is in that sense the preliminary interview helps reject misfits for reasons which don't appear in the application forms, and application forms per se also helps in removing set of candidates. So it's often called as a kind of a courtesy interview, and it's a good public relations exercise. So that means you spend some time with the candidate, inform that yes, we are interested in, then also you would say that we will go through a process of formal selection, but within the time frame. So you also provide some required information to the candidate to prepare and appear for the selection process or selection test, or maybe this final selection interview itself. So that way you are also educating and preparing the candidate through having a preliminary dialogue or a preliminary interview. The preliminary interview is also, at least one interview is to be conducted as a part of this preliminary interview. It is possible that they also meet one or more persons in the organization, and to make sure that you provide the details of the job as well as the organization, its future to the candidate. And always preliminary interview should be made into a two-way process, because the organization will require good candidates and will be competing with other companies for their services, and the individual also would like to know something about the organization. So it should allow the company to determine what the candidates likes are, and whether or not he or she could do the job, and all the things whatever I mentioned to you earlier, whether they would fit into the existing team or not. So candor is important, because the company will want both to employ and retain the best candidates. So openness, free and frank discussions always helps in attracting and retaining some of the best of the candidates. So it is in this, after the preliminary interview and the screening, so one would always next step to discuss and talk about is the selection test. See, the tests depend upon the different jobs and the, and also the organization. But the test determines the applicant's ability, aptitude and personality depending on what kind of test one would like to deploy and gather the required data. So, the certain things are, certain tests are available with respect to the personality, certain things and attitudes can be done, activities could be done to understand the aptitudes, as well as some interest inventories and things like that also can be deployed to understand the aptitude, and one certainly would like to know the applicant's ability in terms of the motor skills or the coordination and things like that, where eye-hand coordination and things like that you want to explore through appropriate selection tests. The tests range from simple intelligence quotient IQ tests or to reasoning tests to a kind of a residential outbound or outward bound courses where people can be observed not only during the course but also during informal settings and informal interactions. But these are not really called as the selection tests. The selection tests are referred to as basically as the psychological tests. These test the candidate's ability to work with others, identify leadership qualities, examine behavior under stress. These are all part of the exploration in any assessment center kind of a methodology. So, when you are looking at the types of tests, this is ability tests. Some of the abilities are clearly time linked. Some, like, we would like to see how many words somebody can type per minute. So, time based kind of a test. So, the stenographic kind of a test. Then one would like to get into an aptitude test like GMAT. So, whether somebody has a management aptitude. In a management aptitude, you would analyze the scope for doing the quantitative analysis, the reasoning abilities, then also see the things in its abstraction, things like that. So, the graduate management aptitude test or the GMAT would get that kind of an aptitude of the candidate to pursue management careers. Similarly, the personality tests, one can think of simpler forms like the FIRO-B, the fundamental interpersonal response orientation, or it could be the Myers and Briggs kind of a learning style kind of an instrument, or it could be the Big Five personality, or the 16 PF is another test called the 16 personality factors, or one also can use this CPI or the California personality inventory. The question is that many of these tests are standardized, well accepted by the industry and by many organizations, and widely used, and expertise and insights and understanding are available. So, the question is which type of test one would like to deploy and how much time it is going to take. So, once you are able to identify, usually you will see the ability tests, they are highly reliable, and some of the ability tests in terms of verbal reasoning and numerical tests have shown very high validity for a wide range of jobs, that it is able to predict some of the job success, and then the validity also increases, we have seen, with increasing complexity of the job. So, the higher the complexity of the job, one can also see in a very confident way that the ability tests are most useful. And the combination of aptitude tests have higher validities than individual tests alone. So, that means if you are able to do a battery of tests and then you are able to get and gather some data, that is more preferable. So, so it is always desirable that you try and cover good number of people and also the multiple tests, so that the candidates can be classified. Scoring of the test may be completed by today certainly the scanners, and then so that you can cut down on the cost, because all the personality tests, many organizations see it as a very cost, or it's a proposition involving high costs. So that's the reason one need to understand the time it involves, the complexity it involves, and the kind of cost as well. So the organizations always would like to see if a standardized test, and if it can be administered by anyone, like stenographic test or some dictation test, it is always easy to be administered by a professional. Then you come and demand for the support of a psychologist. I think then one need to see how costly it is or how difficult it is to do this. So the time, cost, and expertise become one of the one set of criteria to choose or go with the selection test. Then so it is where the disadvantages also one need to see. It is the minorities, non-minorities typically score one standard deviation above the minorities. So it may result in adverse impact. So that means it should not discriminate people on any of the criteria, where it should not be disadvantageous to a particular group. So it could be the rural and urban. So if a particular selection test where urban candidates are going to perform better, so then you must see how can you make it culture neutral, or it does not differentiate the ability of someone to do some good work in English should not influence his performance on the test. So one would like to see how to cut down this influence of the language. Similarly, the differences between males and females, that is the gender differences in abilities. So then the students, they strongly feel that certain knowledge, certain background in certain areas influencing their performance, that means it is not favoring a group of people. So there are some handicaps, there are some issues. So the ability test, when we see, should not predict some of the differences in the category itself. So a selection procedure, particularly the personality test, is the characteristics of the application that are related to the future job performance. And personality tests typically measure one or more of the 5 personality dimensions, like this: extroversion, emotional stability, the agreeableness, conscientiousness, and the openness to experience. So these are all identified as big 5 personality, and people have established its validity and the reliability. So once you have the personality test in place, it can result in lower turnover, because if the applicants are selected for traits that are highly correlated with the employees who have high longevity, so with the organization. So that means these two factors are highly correlated, and such things will help in terms of predictive validity of the test, so that you are able to pick candidates who are going to be successful in the future. And personality test also can reveal more information about applicants' abilities and interests. So one can extrapolate the kind of traits what they have, and then see whether the individual is likely to accept or reject, or partially successful or totally successful, and things like that. One can try and use this information to predict the future performance of the individual on the job. But the difficulty or the disadvantages is to measure personality traits, and that may not be very well defined. Sometimes it is very difficult to see comprehensively the kind of measures. Applicants' training and experience may have a greater impact on job performance than applicants' personality. So in other words, an extrovert or an introvert, or somebody is creative or not, somebody possesses the leadership qualities or not. So some of these things become really or really may not predict and have less predictive validity, whereas one's experience and the kind of training they have undergone have more explanatory powers. So the question is, the responses by applicant may be altered by applicants' desire to respond in a way they feel would result in their selection, called the social desirability. So, sometimes they also respond in such a way that what is wanted by the organization. So, sometimes the personality tests do not help us to pick exactly the candidates who are going to perform and who are going to be successful in the future. But the kind of test whatever we have talked about, the cost becomes extremely prohibitive, because in terms of the time it takes and also the interpretation of the results can only be done by trained professionals, if not the psychologists. So, the lack of evidence also to support that the validity of the use of the personality test in terms of predicting the job success. So, whatever may be, then one has to look at very closely when selecting the test. So, in terms of the criteria, what is its reliability? That means whatever the time you are able to repeat the test, it gives almost similar results, and also the validity in terms of what it's supposed to measure and whether it measures or not, and such measures does provide a kind of or correlated with similar measures or not, and then some validity means somebody is going to be successful or not. What are these kind of a past numbers, and whether they were able to predict in the past the success as well. So, we are talking about the predictive validity. And also one would like to see the objectivity in terms of that there is no personal biases and actions, but one would be able to see in an unbiased way, express comfortably about their preferences, about their own personal characteristics. Another important thing is the standardization. Standardization in terms of whether it can be applied to different groups, or it is only to be applicable to the school children between the age group of this and that. So, which is the population in which the details have been obtained, and whether it is only specific to that group or it could be applied to the other groups as well. And in this context we need to see what is this employment interview. So, we have briefly looked at in terms of the selection, and in the selection process the various tests, and the tests, as you can always see, there are simple ability related tests and there are personality tests. But as you move from ability to the personality test, a trained person's help is required. But when you see interviews, the interview is the most commonly used and according to many the most abused form of selection tool. But it is a formal, in-depth conversation conducted to evaluate the applicant's acceptability. So, a dialogue between the interviewer and the interviewee, the organizational member and the applicant. And so, since it provides a face-to-face dialogue, according to many, it is an excellent selection device. And the popularity of the selection process stems from its flexibility. It is simple, it is straightforward, and then one can have this kind of a dialogue and document the details for future action. So, that is how the employment interview is widely used, and normally can be adapted to the different levels of jobs, may it be unskilled or skilled, managerial, professional. Any number of job kind of situations, you see the employment interview could be one of the methods which has all the flexibility and less of rigor, but one can apply it and does not require a great preparation. So, the point is that it allows two-way information exchange between the the interviewers and the applicants. And when we see this, the employment interview process, one can think in terms of one-to-one, that is one interviewer and the one interviewee, or it is sequential where the candidate meets not only one person but set of people one after the other. that is sequential, or it could be the panel where a set of interviewers will sit together and then have a dialogue with the candidate. So, in one-to-one interview there are only two participants, the interviewer and the interviewee, or in the sequential interview it takes one-to-one step further and it involves a series of interviews of that one-to-one. And in another, each interviewer can ask questions in relation to his or her subject areas, so that they finally will compare their notes. But in the panel interview, it consists of two or more people, and then interviewers and the candidate, they are there together, and one can also go up to 15. So the question is, how many interviewers could interview one candidate? So it is, you see that as we go for that kind of a panel interview, it is less intimate and becomes more formal than to one, and if handled and organized well, it can provide a wealth of information, but otherwise it can also be insulting and very bad from the experience of the interviewee. So interview has at least three objectives, and helps obtain additional information from the applicant compared to what the candidate has provided. You will get more insights, you will get better understanding of the person, what he or she stands for, what are his broad success and other aspects. It also facilitates giving general information from the applicant, such as the company policies, the job, the product manufacturing and the like, so that you can also share some of the critical information, and within that, what is that you are looking for, what do you think would be the kind of a future things. And also it helps build the company's image in front of the applicant. So if you are fair, if you are systematic, if you are open, if you are with humor, you are making the candidates comfortable, all builds a positive image of the company and also positive image of the job. So the interview objectives is basically to attract and also provide a positive experience to the candidate. But when you see the usual types of interviews, we can basically classify them into 5 categories. The first one called the structured interviews, second one is unstructured interviews, and the third one is the mixed interview, and the fourth one could be called as behavioral interview, and the last one could be the stress interview. We will go through some of these things, and then we will also continue our discussion on these types of interviews in the next lecture as well. As we see that the structured interview means the type of questions are predetermined. So a predetermined checklist of questions, and then typically you ask these questions to all. Probably, why are you joining the organization? Very clear. So you would also like to get the details in terms of what are the aspirations, what kind of jobs are preferred within the choice what the organization could provide. So a predetermined checklist, and whether they are willing to travel and relocate themselves. So many of these things, if it is involved in the job performance or as a part of the set of duties, it is best to explore through a very structured checklist, and a structured interview always helps in writing and getting the responses of the candidates and comparing it later on. It is the application also becomes very useful here, because it is useful for valid results, and then particularly when dealing with a large number of applicants. So that is where the usual application of the structured interview, the structured interview is much more better than when you have very few number of people. And so in an unstructured interview, the few or any planned questions. So that means most of the questions are evolving. questions are made up during the interview. In an unstructured interview, there is no pattern of when you start and what all the questions you need to ask, whether it is even required or not required. In an unstructured interview, the questions and discussions evolve, but people make sure that all the expected things are asked and then answers are obtained so that an appropriate decisions can be made about the suitability or otherwise of the candidate. So, in the usual application of the unstructured interviews are where you really don't know the details of the candidates, particularly the personal details of the candidates, and then so it is usual it is most useful in that kind of a situation where the personal details do have implication for the job performance. And a combination of structured and unstructured questions can be used, and that's what it is in terms of the mixed interview would come. So that means a set of standardized questions and also some exploring and some unstructured questions. So together it makes sense to look at the candidate. So when you have not too big a number of candidates and not too small a number of candidates, then the mixed interviews are usually the best. So the usual application of this could be seen as it's a very realistic approach that yields comparable answers plus some in-depth insights about the candidate. So you can always get some motivation of the candidate and also some background and which are comparable with from one to the other. So the mixed interviews you are able to capture both. And then you have this kind of a behavioral interviews. In a behavioral interview kind of a thing, the questions are basically of probing the past experiences of the candidate. So usually the questions are limited to a hypothetical situation, and then you make an evaluation which is based on how the candidate has approached the problem, what solution has he provided, and then around that you will see what is that the candidate is able to comprehend, explore, analyze, understand, and then respond. I think that's what you try and do it in a behavioral interview. So it is most useful under the circumstances where you are more bothered about the reasoning and the analytical abilities, and then you also see whether he is able to cope with these things within the given time. So the behavioral interview questions typically would involve one or more of these things. So one could ask, describe a time you had to work with someone you did not like, or how would you handle a boss you suspected of performing unethical actions. So that means under the circumstances, under given these behaviors, what would you do? You as a supervisor, you walk into the shop floor, things are very disorganized, and one of the employees is arguing with a coworker. So what do you do? So the question is, what do you do, or how have you handled how have you handled such situations in the past would give some thought about what is desirable and what is that one has handled. So it throws up some of the preparations of the individual and the comfort level. It also could be, would you describe yourself as an innovative person? Give us some example of something particularly innovative that you have done that made a difference in the workplace. So instead of asking, do you have a leadership qualities, where somebody would say yes or no, so then one would like to ask, okay, give me some example of your leadership attempt in terms of maybe inspiring people or directing people or taking set of people along to complete a task. What is that you have done in your past career or in past assignment or in your school and college days? So such probing is what typically constitutes the behavioral interview. Some more question. What was the last time you were late with the project? Or tell me about a time when you had to stick by a decision you had made, even though it made you very unpopular. So what is that kind of a situation? So in other words, the behavioral interview provides an opportunity to understand the candidate and how he or she would respond to various alternatives and the scenarios. But in contrast to the behavioral interview, the stress interviews are to generate a series of conditions through a series of harsh and rapid fire questions. So basically you are trying to upset the applicant and then try to capture what he or she would like to respond. So these kinds of applications are most useful in understanding how the candidate would behave in jobs which are basically stress prone. It could be the handling complaints, or it is the medical representatives who go and meet the doctors, and they have to wait for long hours, and after waiting for long hours, when they meet the doctor, they are supposed to keep up the same calmness or the comfort, and so that they represent properly the company. Instead of that, if somebody gets upset for waiting for the doctor and then goes inside and makes a hue and cry about waiting, then means not only he spoils the relationship from one-to-one level, but also the company business may get affected. In other words, those of them who represent the company in the field must have patience, must have tolerance, and must have ability to cope with several stress-prone situations. They cannot transfer some of their own ambiguities, their own agonies to the customer. That is where the stress interviews do help. So a stress interview is where the employer lines up a bunch of interviewers, one at a time, or maybe en masse or as a group. So his mission is to intimidate the applicant or confuse the applicant or create that, but to make sure that the candidate is responding and also capturing the style of the response and see what more can be done. So to find out the candidate's ability, how he handles that kind of a stress situations. So the stress interviews might involve not only the testing applicants' behavior in a busy environment, but it also further explores the dimensions of the behavior and its usefulness in the actual job context. So in other words, one could see how do you, that is handling particularly the work overload or dealing with people and project complexities, or particularly when the multiple tasks are involved. So as we are seeing here, the selection process would involve several of the steps, a series of steps depending on how you intend to do. It could be very structured, standardized ways of exploring with the candidate, or it could be the pretty informal, what people call it as unstructured, but you can also use a kind of a mixed interview, but many would like to use behavioral based interviews. Behavioral based interviews where you can capture the success, the details of the candidate, whatever he has done in the past. Sometimes you also have to design a stress interview where the kind of jobs the candidates are going to perform in the field involves handling of complexities, handling of people who are very important to the organization, but the candidate as an employee should not go and express his or her stress and create confusing situation to the customer or the client. And that is where the stress interviews are very useful in understanding and analyzing the potential of the candidate to have that calmness, to have the right attitudes. But in a nutshell, what we have talked about so far is this. So we are talking about the selection process and the concept and the definition and the role of the selection process, then the selection process itself in terms of the various activities, and also the types of interviews, and then also some of the concerns what we have about the interviews. But we need to explore a little more about the interview, the errors and other things committed by the interviewers, the panelists, and also some of the dynamics of the situation, what can come in the selection process. So what we will do in our lecture or in the coming session is to see what are some of the common interview problems, and we should also have a close look at in terms of the advantages and the disadvantages of the interview, and then the references and the background checks and how we need to use at the time of selection, and also finally making these selection decisions. And while making selection decisions, one also has to see the details like how to make the job offer, how do we see the contracts of employment, and then how can we see the evaluation of the selection process, and also understand the legal aspects of recruitment and selection, and maybe we should also see some of the important problems which can come, and that is where I have also put one more thought before you is selection in Indian organizations. And when we see the selection becomes a socio-economic, political and the managerial decision, and that is where we also need to evaluate some of the Indian dimensions, Indian problems of selection which may not be same or similar in other countries. I hope with this we will look into much more critically the next steps of the selection process.